Welcome, everybody. My name is Reverend Irene Willis Hassan, and I am the Minister for Refugee and Migration Services at UCC National Ministries. I'm here today with Reverend Noel Anderson, who is the leader of the UCC's National Collaborative on Immigration, and also works for Church World Service. So today is going to be the last part of this 4-part series on types of forced migration. The topic of today is going to be asylum. I think that this is the most important topic of the 4 sessions. So I do encourage you to bear with us. This is going to be an hour-and-a-half long session because of how complicated asylum is. So if you do need to drop off early, that's okay. This will be recorded and available on the UCC Refugee and Migration Services website after the live session. So the reason why I think this is the most important kind of forced migration topic to work with is because, first of all, we don't have enough churches engaged in it. Most of the churches in the UCC that are engaged in active refugee ministries are with refugees or humanitarian parolees because of the situation with Afghanistan and Ukraine. This is great. We are eternally grateful to all those churches for staying engaged in these important matters that came up in this unusual year of 2022. There's a couple reasons why asylum is going to be another important topic that's happening in immigration right now that both Noel and I will cover. But mainly that a lot of the policies at the border have been rapidly changing over the last 6 months, 2 or 3 years, really. So we'll go into that. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the PowerPoint, and we'll go through that so that you can have a better understanding of the asylum system and also the reasons why it's rapidly changing and what the church can do to meet those needs. So bear with me for a second. I'm just going to share screen. There we go. Okay, overview of asylum. So this infographic kind of shows you the asylum process. As I've said in previous sessions, every person that is a refugee, like a registered refugee, has at one point been an asylum seeker. An asylum seeker goes to a border country or a secondary country and says, I'm going to die, I'm persecuted, I will die if I stay in my home country. That is the only way to claim asylum. It doesn't work if you just say, I don't like my country, it's corrupt, I'm not making enough money there. That is not considered a valid, credible threat to claim asylum. It's only if you can meet this very narrow definition of persecution, which, if you remember from the first session, is based on, the 1940s and the political climate of forced migration in the 1940s, and has not since been updated. We now know that there's lots of reasons why people migrate. Definitely persecution and death threats being a huge one of those. But this is the only valid reason considered by the US government to seek asylum in the United States. You have to demonstrate a credible threat. So the person fleeing persecution approaches what's usually the US southern border, but it doesn't have to be. You can fly on an airplane, you can go to the northern border, but you come to a border and you say, I'm going to die if I stay in my home country. Then that person is transferred to an ICE detention facility where they await processing, and they have to go through a number of screenings, which can be extremely grueling, basically asking for proof or other reasons why specifically you are going to die if you stay in your home country. Now, there's been a lot of changes to the way that this has happened in the last couple of years. Like I said, lots of changes to the asylum process. It used to be that you had to be a certified and trained individual to process those claims and decide whether or not it's actually what's called a credible threat. They've changed that recently so that more types of Border Patrol officers can assess for credible threat. Less qualified people can assess for credible threat, which creates a system of bias that makes people more vulnerable to deportation, which puts them at higher risk of dying and being sent back to their home country. Not to mention the journey coming to a border is often extremely grueling. That's true anywhere in the world where someone becomes an asylum seeker. Asylum isn't just for the US southern border, that's just the border to our country, right? You can be an asylum seeker in Kenya, you can be an asylum seeker in Jordan, you can be an asylum seeker anywhere where you leave your home country and go to a secondary country and claim persecution. Now, because our border is Central America, a lot of folks that are coming up seeking asylum come from Central America, which means that they have walked through the Sonoran Desert, which is very barren. A lot of people die on that journey of thirst and exposure. Also, a lot of people take a train called La Bestia, which means that they go on this fast-moving freight train that comes up to the United States border, and a lot of people die on that journey as well because it's a fast-moving train. So if that gives you any indication about the desperation that comes with seeking asylum, that yes, indeed, whatever your reasons are, if it's more reasonable for you to jump on a moving train or walk through a barren desert than it is for you to stay at home, you probably have a good reason for doing so. I personally can't imagine doing that. We do have a ministry in the United Church of Christ. I'll highlight this ministry a couple times. It's great, called the Green Valley Saharitas Samaritans, that's run in tandem with Good Shepherd UCC in Arizona, where they bring water to the desert and do shepherding ministry with folks that are coming up to the border to seek asylum who may be very near death, or often they do find dead bodies and help process that experience in the most helpful way possible. So we're proud to have them as part of our UCC family that works with immigration ministries. Anyway, so back to this asylum process. So if they do make it to the border without dying in the desert or on a boat, folks come from Haiti, Cuba, elsewhere through the Caribbean on boats as well, which is a different type of dangerous journey. If they don't die and they make it to the border, people also fly into Mexico, to be clear. There's also people that fly into Mexico to claim asylum. We see lots of folks from Russia, China, Pakistan, that come up through the southern border to claim asylum. Not so much Ukraine, because there's a different process that was covered in week 3 humanitarian for all for Ukrainians to be able to claim asylum. But there are people that fly into Mexico specifically to claim asylum. So once they make it up to the border, it used to be 3 or 4 years ago that they would be put in these ICE detention centers, vetted for credible threat by a trained officer, and then if it's determined that their story is credible, then they are released to a shelter or released to wherever it is that their final destination is. But then they have to show up for a number of judicial hearings to make sure that that threat was analyzed correctly, and also to adjust their status to be an actual asylum seeker or an asylee, a person that has legitimate asylum rather than just an asylum seeker. The difference between an asylee and an asylum seeker: an asylum seeker wants the asylum. The asylee has been granted it formally through this judicial process that has multiple parts, basically where they have to describe their journey, this terrible journey, and also the terrible things that happened to them back home. And they have to repeat it over and over consistently using correct language that will get them the actual asylum process of the I-589. It's a very difficult and demeaning process and requires a lot of spiritual care. So anyway, they go through these number of interviews that are both in ICE detention centers with Border Patrol and then formally with a judge a couple times. And then either the judge ICE, Border Patrol, or the judge determines, no, I don't think that your threat is credible, and they're deported and sent back, reinstated, I think it's repatriated to their home country, and there's a process for that. Or they are allowed to stay in the United States, and then they have to adjust for asylum, which is called the 589 asylee. And that process can take years. So basically, that's the process. It involves a lot of repeating a terrible story over and over in a way that is judicially palatable, understood by a judge, believed by all these officers. And that would be very hard to do if your first language isn't English, right? So these are ways churches can help that we can talk about further in future slides. That involves a lot of emotional and spiritual care, legal care, to be able to make sure that people are being heard accurately. So once they do get to an ICE detention center, I'm just going to give you some of these acronyms. ICE stands for Immigration and Customs Enforcement. It's a branch of the Department of Homeland Security. I'm going to be touching on ICE and DHS a little bit more because they have recently approached us and our partners at Church World Service with a number of proposals to sort of change the way that ICE detention centers look, to change the way that moving migrants who are asylum seekers through the country looks, which has been interesting. Customs and Border Protection is CBP. They're the folks that patrol the border. They're the first person that migrants meet when they come up and say, I'm here to claim asylum. And then they process them into the shelters. They process them into the detention centers. As of recently this year, there are approximately 8,000 people that approach the border daily in 2022. Most of those folks are not being let through. And the reason for that is because of a number of policies that was put together by the Trump administration that I'll go over the next slide. And then, except for unaccompanied children, which I'll go over in a future slide as well. ICE detention centers tend to be overwhelmed. They have substandard conditions, and they're often audited by professional auditors and found wanting in humanitarian basic necessities. ICE detention centers are subject to all the same rules and regulations as any other prison, private or public, in the United States. But often they don't meet those standards. They're sort of given a slap on the wrist and they go back to doing what they're doing, which is really unfortunate. And Noel and others in the UCC have done a lot of advocacy to see changes in that system. I'm honestly not sure that ICE detention centers will ever be a pleasant or even reasonable place for humans to habitate. But I do think it's interesting, these changes that ICE and DHS are proposing in the next year. And there's reasons why they're making proposals to changes that, again, I'll go over in the next slide. Other language like notice to appear, order of supervision, I just throw these in because these are all part of this grueling process that asylum seekers have to go through in order to be credibly able to stay in the United States. It is not an easy process by any means. So let's talk about border militarization and also securitization. So this has caused very dangerous conditions. And so what I mean by border securitization and militarization is that under the Trump administration, there were several policies that were created to make asylum a very difficult thing to claim. And again, that's sort of illegal. If you go back here, in 1951, the United States agreed with several other countries to be part of a process of accepting asylum as a human right. So to say that people cannot claim asylum goes against our constitutional agreement with the United Nations and with ourselves. So a couple examples of policies are listed here. For example, there's a lot of them that the Trump administration implemented that the Biden administration carried forward, and actually didn't start with Trump. You can really sort of root all of these policies back to even the Clinton administration. They started securitizing the border and making it much more difficult to get through, much more difficult to claim asylum. And as I've stated in previous videos, that's true worldwide. In every country that accepts asylum seekers or refugees, it's much harder to get in now than it was 20 or 30 years ago, despite forced migration being higher per capita than it ever has been. So a couple of these policies, for example, are the Migrant Protection Protocols and Title 42. The Migrant Protection Protocols was, and this is one of the things that makes this relevant to right now and the reason why we should be paying attention to this, the Supreme Court a couple of weeks ago overturned Migrant Protection Protocols. They said that it is unconstitutional. It has yet to actually be lifted because it has to go through a legal judicial process. But basically what it does is, instead of people being able to claim asylum and process for asylum in the United States through the process that I just described, in which they go through ICE and then they go on to a final destination where they apply for a transfer into being an asylee through a legal process, they're making them do that in Mexico. So they're pouring millions, if not billions, I don't know how much the number is, of dollars into Mexico for folks who want to claim asylum to stay there. This makes it very hard because if you need a lawyer and you need support, you need English help, you need to make court dates, how are you going to do it from Mexico? So people are missing their court dates, people are not getting legal representation, people are not able to accurately describe their stories because they're stuck in Mexico, which again was decided unconstitutional by the Supreme Court recently. It also created a situation in which there is higher human trafficking, gang violence, and things like this. For example, the 50-something folks that died in a truck several weeks ago at the Texas border. This is a prime example of what Migrant Protection Protocols has done, is it's create very unsafe conditions that are unstable in Mexico, because Mexico just doesn't have the same infrastructure as the United States does to be able to process asylees safely. Title 42 is a public health policy, or that's what it was supposed to be. It's not really. In which the Trump administration decided to use this public health policy to say no immigration into the United States from the southern border because of COVID. Even though at the time this was implemented, there was way more COVID in the United States than there was in Mexico. So really, it was just sort of used as a veil to not let anyone to the United States. This stands until now. The Biden administration tried to knock it down and remove it, but they were blocked by a federal judge in a court in Louisiana, I think. So Title 42 has been under extreme debate because, again, the problem is that there are 8,000 people coming to the border every day. And so these policies are being used to try to stop people from coming in, but people aren't going to stop needing to not die. So it doesn't actually fix a problem. It really creates a worse problem statistically by creating all this gang violence and human trafficking in Mexico instead of processing people responsibly and with dignity. So Title 42 and the Migrant Protection Protocols are both things that we at UCC National have advocated for overturning. But again, the problem is, what do we do with all these 8,000 people per day that are coming across the border when we don't have capacity to meet their needs in ICE detention centers, which are already substandard. And so it's interesting that ICE and DHS are sort of coming up with alternative ways that Title 42 can be removed and people can come to the United States. It's something they are thinking about and have been in conversation with us at UCC National about. There's other ways in which people have been blocked from seeking asylum that are listed here. One huge and really dehumanizing way is by family separation. This is a very common thing that happens at the border, is that if you are a man traveling with a pregnant woman, they will likely separate the man and the woman just to create difficulty for them to create a family in the United States. make their lives more difficult. We see this happen a lot on the border, is people are deterred from wanting to come to the United States by doing inhumane things like separating families that are arriving at the border. Yeah, so we can talk more about that if anyone's interested more in border securitization, but this is a phenomenon that's been happening for about 30 years and has been getting increasingly more difficult. So once they are released from ICE detention, if they do make it across, the only people that are exempted through Title 42 to come across the border right now are unaccompanied children and people that are especially vulnerable. That basically applies mostly to people that are medically vulnerable. So after they are processed through a detention center, then some of them go to a border shelter in order to rest, get some food, call their families. Most migrants that come through the border actually do have a destination in mind. They probably have friends or family in the United States or a sponsor set up. And so they usually don't stay at these shelters for long. The shelters try to turn folks that are coming through their system over within 2 days. We have a shelter that we cooperate with the Lutherans and the Episcopalians. Again, the folks down in the Southwest Conference of the UCC, shout out to them, cooperate the shelter in, I think it's Nogales, you can correct me if I got the city wrong, Noel, called Cruzando Fronteras. And so that's one of these types of shelters that's sort of a satellite shelter for people to get rest before they move on with processing elsewhere in the United States. These shelters coordinate with CPB, again, that's Border Patrol, and ICE in order to receive folks that come through. Not everyone does go to a shelter. Again, a lot of people have sponsors, and so they continue on to wherever their sponsor is, be it Miami, New York, Oregon, wherever it is that they are going. In the last border call that I was on, which was 2 days ago, yes, it was yesterday, they were saying that they're seeing massive increases of people that actually do not have sponsors set up, that don't have resources, that don't have money for bus tickets. There's a program that a lot of border shelters use called Miles for Migrants, in which people that don't have money for a bus ticket to go to their final destination can get their bus ticket funded by this nonprofit. That nonprofit is overwhelmed and unable to issue any more bus tickets. So if you're looking for a place to donate, that might be a good one in order to not overload the shelters that are at the border and to get people safely to where their final destination is. So for those who don't have a final destination, don't have resources, or maybe do have a little bit of that, but need a little bit of extra help, that's where asylum accompaniment comes in. You can be an asylum accompaniment church, but as I've mentioned in previous sessions, it's much more difficult than if you were to do refugee resettlement, because a refugee is an asylum seeker who's already gotten all their processing done. So they have the ability to work. They have access to cash assistance like TANF and food stamps and other resources like case management. Asylum seekers don't have these things. They are totally dependent on whoever their host is. Also, they have all these different hearings that they need to go to, the asylum merits hearing, the notice to appear. They get all of these things that they have to understand legally, and there's not enough immigration lawyers to be able to help them out with these things. So if you choose to do asylum accompaniment, then you're going to be doing a lot of wading through legal information and trying to decipher all of these forms that they have to fill out to be able to stay. And it's really a life or death situation, because if those forms are done incorrectly or the hearing is done poorly, that person gets deported. So like I said, it takes a lot of effort and a lot of discernment to be an asylum accompaniment church. Of course, the payoff of making sure that a family is able to safely stay in the United States and is processed eventually for a 589, which again makes them an asylee, which gives them the same benefits as a refugee, the cash assistance and the food stamps and so forth. That's an immense gift that you can give another human being. And a lot of our churches do it. We do have a large handful of churches that are doing this. It's not doable. So we have a toolkit that was developed by Noel and a couple of my predecessors that explains more about how this process works, why you can do it, what kind of support you could get. But also, I do want to hand it over to Noel at this point so he can speak more about this, since his church is personally hosting an asylum seeker right now. And he's intimately familiar. So, Noel, I'm going to hand it over to you to talk a little bit more about Asylum Covenant. Thanks for being here with us.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me part of this webinar series. It's very important. This educational work. I'm just getting over COVID, so excuse me. Um, so I think the first things that I think Reverend Willis Hassan has really hit on a lot of the main themes already, and one of the things that we're finding is that congregations have been very active in welcoming and accompanying asylum seekers for really the last several years or more. The first big waves we were seeing really over first with unaccompanied children in 2014, but then more and more 2019 was a big year, for example, and and under the pandemic, we've had a real struggle with the Title 42 misuse of the public health code to try to block asylum seekers from presenting a credible fear claim. And we'll talk more about that in our advocacy section. But there has been a steady flow of people being able to come through an exemption process, and currently that exemption process exists because of the litigation strategy led by the ACLU, and the name of the plaintiff is Wisha. So if you look that up, it's HUISHA. You'll find a lot of information about that, and that's in our toolkits as well. And so we're really seeing family units come through because that's really what the litigation, what the judge from that trial has mandated. So there is a pretty good steady flow of folk coming. And so what we've seen is that a lot of our congregations have been doing this work, have helped several families, and it is become more difficult in terms of a couple of things, mainly legal support and housing. Pro bono immigration lawyers are very difficult to find now, especially for asylum cases. And so then we really start to look at low bono or discounted immigration lawyers, which can be still quite expensive to do a full-on asylum case. There's also a lot of questions around, lawyers not wanting to take cases that aren't the strongest cases. So, it's very common that a Central American, for example, might have been threatened, because they couldn't pay the quotas or the taxes that the gangs are imposing on their businesses. A brother-in-law or somebody gets beat up or even killed, and so they flee. Well, that can be a very difficult case to prove in court because do you have the evidence? Do we have the death certificate of a family member? All of those things. So that's been a real challenge. Another challenge is housing. In most of our metro areas, we've seen increased housing pricing, increased housing crunches. And so whereas in the past, the congregations have been able to even sometimes pay regular rent, that is getting more difficult. And so a lot of these things, we need to reach out to our partner organizations, those immigrants' rights groups, people who know immigration lawyers, and we need to reach out to other partners who know about housing. Sometimes refugee agencies might help out a little bit. And so, we, in the case, I'll just speak a little bit about Gustavo Hermano and Delia, his wife, and their daughter Vilma. I'm currently serving as sabbatical pastor at Ainsworth United Church of Christ. in Portland, Oregon. And so, the housing scenario they had previously was very precarious, and I won't go into details, but very difficult dealings with the landlord. And so, we were eventually able to help them find some housing, but they are, paying their own rent because the church really couldn't commit to that level of financial assistance. And so really understanding, where your congregation is at, what is your level of commitment, all of the other sort of community resources connecting people to the social services, that's something this church is strong at. So those are the avenues that we've been going through. We may end up pivoting from an asylum case to a U visa case on this because asylum cases are very difficult to win. And so trying to really have an analysis of what are the other legal strategies and really pushing the immigration lawyers and pushing folk to get a hold of their lawyers and really look at these different avenues. The other thing I'll say is that, and I want to talk a little bit more about advocacy. I know that's in an ongoing slide here, but I do think that we are in a place where we have to look at, what does it really mean to have a case management infrastructure, to really have government funding to help with the same types of services that we have under refugee resettlement. And so we were able to do that we were able to get funds for example, the Afghans who were coming under humanitarian parole, because they also have to affirmatively apply for asylum. And so we were able to get some funds for the case management infrastructure. So that creating the humane reception system, there is a pilot program we'll talk a little bit more about for that, that's coming through DHS Civil Rights Division. So there is some progress there, but we have a long ways to go. So is it okay to take questions, or do you want me to hold on that so far?
We'll take questions at the end. Thanks, Noel.
Okay.
If you don't mind, but look, here you are on the next slide.
Yeah.
If you don't mind talking a little bit about what sanctuary church is and the sanctuary movement, I would appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah. So, when we look at the history of the sanctuary movement, is very tied to asylum. In the 1980s, thousands of migrants were coming through, political refugees, but they weren't recognized as such because of the politics of the Cold War at the time. And so, being able to welcome thousands through our church networks and sort of almost underground railroad type structure from the border to major cities, we really saw that have a lot of successes with eventually being able to win temporary protected status and refugee status for Central Americans in the 80s and the 90s. But, the newer version that we've seen is trying to stop people from being deported. So inviting people who have deportation orders into our congregations to stop that deportation order and to try to keep their families together. Now, currently, we don't have any active sanctuary cases of folk living in congregations in the Biden administration. We did a little bit in the beginning, but they all got stays of removal, or essentially the new ICE memo, the new policies coming out from ICE really more or less protected most people who would be in sanctuary. So we're not seeing those same cases right now, but what we are seeing is, the sanctuary congregations really stepping up to do the asylum accompaniment. And there are, of course, some times where asylum seekers are denied. They go to court, they're denied, they lose their case. And that means that they're going to be in a situation where they'll be, again, fighting a deportation order. And so we do have some of those cases out there. They're not cases generally that go public, but it is very similar sanctuary work and trying to accompany people through these discernment processes. Sometimes asylum seekers decide to go home at that point. It's or they decide to figure out a way to go ahead and continue to live here, potentially undocumented, and those are all the person who's impacted. It's their decision process. And so, these things are intertwined, even though there's kind of different policies that impact. A lot of the people who were in sanctuary in the Trump era had lived here 10, 20 years, whereas most of the asylum seekers we're talking about are newly arrivals and trying to get resettled. But the type of work is of course very similar. Prophetic nature of it, the advocacy, the accompaniment of people who are newly arriving, trying to get their feet on the ground, and or people who are trying to keep their family together and stop a deportation.
So I agree. What Noel is saying is that a sanctuary church, basically, that's not a new arrival. Usually, it's someone that is at risk of being deported. That they've already gone through all that legal stuff, and it's been determined that they can't claim asylum, and they're going to get deported. A church,
Well, there's kind of a blurry line about like when we especially because when we talk about a lot of churches claim sanctuary first in the 80s. Right. So there's the public sanctuary case now where you actually have someone living in your church, but then there's also the act of being a sanctuary church or congregation, which may or may not include that. So it's really about there in the UCC, for example, we have overlaps of the immigrant welcoming congregation, which is also a model similar to the sanctuary church. Where it's really just all about what does it mean to welcome and be open arms to those immigrants who are in need for whatever reason, whether they're asylum seekers or undocumented people.
Right. So I put the link, and I'll put the link in the email, like I always put the links in the email, in the follow-up email, to the sanctuary movement, where you can learn more about advocacy for doing things like changing the system, or how these things that Noel has described, or also if you do want to host a undocumented immigrant, an undocumented immigrant being a person that is at risk of being deported. And because churches are considered sacred places, it's debatable whether or not ICE is allowed to go in there and physically and forcefully remove people. But we found that if it's a public case, they usually don't, because it would create sort of a nasty intersection of church and state for ICE to come into a sacred space to forcibly remove someone, which is the idea. And sanctuary church has been used in multiple ways over the course of its existence for different populations in need of protection that otherwise would have been detained by the state. So I'll put that link in the follow-up email if you're interested in learning more about how to be part of the movement to make sure that forceful and illegal deportations decrease, is basically the hope of the sanctuary church movement. So I touched a little bit. Thank you, Noel. I appreciate you sharing. And we'll come back to Noel in a couple slides about advocacy. So I want to talk a little bit more about unaccompanied children. Like I said, unaccompanied children are the only type of migrant coming through the southern border that are automatically just allowed to be let in. They don't have to go through these hearings in the same way that an adult would. And for that reason, we've seen a 192% increase in the last 2 years of unaccompanied children, of folks that are saying, well, if any of us are going to survive, I want it to be the kids. So they just leave them at the border. And instead of being put in ICE detention, an unaccompanied minor will go through the Office of Refugee Resettlement and put in a more private, more humane holding facility through the ORR. Or they go through a foster care system, and you can sign up with Bethany Christian Services to be foster care for refugee youth, which means they'll probably only stay with you for a couple days before they're transferred to friends or family that may be in the United States. Most of them do have friends or family. It's just an idea of how do we reunite them once a child and they cannot voice exactly who they're there to see, is one of the big problems with that. Now, refugee foster care isn't true in every place in every state. Bethany only operates this program out of certain areas. And again, that's a traumatized child that probably doesn't speak English, probably isn't going to stay with you very long. But if you are interested in learning about refugee foster care and taking care of an unaccompanied child for a couple days, then you can sign up with Refugee Foster Care at Bethany Christian Services, which will also be in the follow-up email. And again, that's not everywhere. That's only in certain states they operate this program. So Noel and I have both talked about changes in ICE and DHS, which again is the Department of Homeland Security. They are trying to find ways to utilize their ICE detention centers less, probably just because they don't want to get audited as much or put in the news as much. But so they have done a number of things to change recently. One of those being this sort of odd thing that the governor of Texas did as a sort of slight to Washington, D.C., in which the state of Texas is busing migrants up to D.C. if they want to go. And this turned out to actually be a great program in a lot of ways. A lot of the migrants who wanted to go to who wanted to move northward did take those buses and did receive respite care, which means, again, the same thing border shelters do, where it's temporary care, getting them food, clothing, rest, and a phone call before they move on in DC. And so DHS looked at that model that Texas put forward, which again was just sort of meant to be a slight against the government, but ended up being this interesting proposal. And they decided that they want to actually replicate that model and start sending people out to different cities across the United States in coordination with church denominations and other nonprofit partners, including us. So ICE and DHS has approached us asking us to find churches specifically in New York City, Boston, Miami, Dallas, and Los Angeles that are willing to take part in creating a respite center along with other nonprofits and funding from DHS to help migrants who are moving through and get them away from the border quicker and to their final destination quicker. So if you're in one of these cities, you're interested in learning more about this respite program that's meant to emulate the model of the buses to DC, then I would be happy to talk to you about that. It's still in the very preliminary stages. We don't have loads of information, but if you would like to sign up for information as it progresses, I would be happy to do so. DHS is also launching their case management pilot program, which Church World Service, our partner, and also Noel works for them. They're going to be helping co-manage this program for DHS to find case management in these places for asylum seekers to be able to process efficiently. And all of this is meant to help with the border shelters that often become overwhelmed and to allow for Title 42 and the migrant protection protocols to be successfully overturned without overwhelming the system. So DHS is thinking of ideas. They have involved UCC National and Church World Service in coming up with these ideas. But if you'd like to participate in helping migrants sort of process more quickly and efficiently and with more support, these are the ways that they're thinking about doing it, and they have asked us to be involved. Another way that you can support asylum seekers, we have a couple churches across the denomination that do this, is to visit ICE detention centers. You can visit and provide emotional and spiritual support. Like I said, people that have gone through the asylum process have gone through a desert, have gotten on a dinghy boat, have ridden a train. They've done something that is terrifying to get there, and then they get thrown in this detention facility that pretty much treats them like cattle. And so, one thing that the church can do is go in and say, I see you as a human being and I see what you've been through, and I will stand with you as witness while you're going through this process. It doesn't mean nothing to be able to do that. And we do have churches that do participate in visiting ICE detention centers. This is a difficult ministry because a lot of those folks do get deported, and it rips out a small piece of your heart every time that you make a relationship with a person, and then one day they disappear. Knowing Spanish, of course, is a bonus. 75% of folks that are in ICE detention are Spanish speakers, or indigenous languages of Central America speakers. And you could also participate in helping transport people to their ICE check-ins. If they have been released from a detention center, they probably still have to go back and check in. So making sure people get to their appointments and are getting their mail so that they know when they have their next hearing of the millions of hearings that they have to go through. These are good, solid ways that you can support asylum seekers without full-on taking on accompaniment. Also advocacy. Here's a picture of some folks from our own UCC advocating for changes in ICE detention centers, which, as I showed you on the previous page, these are ways that ICE and DHS are trying to change it by utilizing us more. So these are different things that you can do that don't full on involve the heaviness of asylum accompaniment, because we do understand that asylum accompaniment is a really deep process that is worth it. And we do encourage churches that feel like they have capacity or would like to learn more about it to do accompaniment, but there's different ways that you can be involved as well, including going and visiting ICE detention. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Noel to talk about advocacy strategy, because again, a lot of the reasons why we are seeing changes in DHS and ICE, and the reason why they're coming to us at UCC National to talk about proposals to these changes is because we are excellent advocates at saying this, the system needs to be changed. So I'm going to hand over to Noel to talk about ways that we can do that.
Sure, yeah. So one of the things I mentioned was around Title 42. This is a Trump era policy that was a Stephen Miller brainchild, as some of you know who that is, has worked his whole life to essentially create anti-immigrant policies. And unfortunately, it's been upheld too long in the Biden administration. The coverage of the border, like many of us have seen, invokes an invasion rhetoric that is xenophobic and actually racist policies and rhetoric around, particularly a lot of anti-Black policies. A lot of Haitians and Africans have been particularly discriminated in the asylum process through Title 42, and there's been recently quite a few deaths of Haitians, many of who were previously expelled from Title 42 and then chose to try to cross through the desert. We mentioned the story of the trailer and of migrants and over 50 folk that died in San Antonio. That was also linked to Title 42 expulsions. So, the Title 42 is still in effect, even though we have these exemptions. And the administration did try to rescind it, and that was taken up by a group of Republican states, governors. And there is currently a preliminary injunction that keeps Title 42 in place. Even worse would be some of the proposals that include some Democrat bipartisan, such as the Langford-Sinema bill, that would essentially extend Title 42 almost indefinitely. It would be very difficult to get to the markers underneath this legislation to actually end Title 42. And so we are seeing this come up again. There's a lot of need for advocacy, particularly in the Senate, but I understand an amendment similar to this made it through Appropriations Committee in the House. It may not matter much because people are expecting a continuing resolution in the budget and appropriations process rather than a new bill. But just to say that this is a very live discussion in Congress and very well could pass, and Title 42 could become codified. into law. And that would not be a good thing for the active effort that we are trying to restore asylum to, the way that the laws are written about Title 42 in the 1980 Refugee Act. So, that being said, we're really asking folk to, the Interfaith Immigration Coalition just did a webinar, maybe some of you joined, all about this very subject, about how do we heal and not harm and restore asylum. And we can, you can access these links on the recording. We'll send these out and everything, but we're doing call-in days. The UCC is working on sending out an action alert with Katie Adams and our DC advocacy office. And there's a few other things, sign-on forms that are actually already due this Friday. And then, this being August recess, we're asking people to meet with their legislators, as well as hold vigils and work with asylum seekers in your area. Make sure that those who are willing, or those who are excited about telling their public stories, to get those stories out there. And so yeah, that's a little bit about the advocacy strategy there, and this is going to be an ongoing thing. The other piece of the advocacy strategy is around the humane reception system and the case management infrastructure, which we mentioned there's a pilot program, but as we move forward, we're looking to expand that pilot program significantly. So the CWS will be getting money from DHS, as will other entities with refugee agencies, I believe. And so, refugee agencies are the ones most equipped to provide the type of services needed, but there needs to be funding for that. So, and this includes all the things we're mentioning in accompaniment. So things like housing and connecting people to social services, and helping find work permits, helping people find jobs when they're able to work, helping enroll kids in schools, and all of the other things, mental health services, ELL, English language learners, and the list goes on. So yeah, that pretty much, I think that shows, just how a lot of times advocacy overlaps with direct service. A lot of times we're advocating for funding or policies that support the ability to do the direct service work in a more effective, efficient way with enhanced capacity.
Totally. So these links will also be shared, as always, in the follow-up email if you would like to sign on or participate in any of these advocacy events. Like I said, events like this are the reason why DHS is attempting to change any of its policies. So it's very important. And like Noel said, is directly tied to direct service. So if you are unable to accompany or visit or be directly present with asylum seekers, that's just fine. Doing this advocacy is vitally important as well, because it enables professionals and others in the church and elsewhere to be able to do that direct service. So I always put on a proposed action model, basically talk with your church about what you can provide, what your calling and gifts are, partner with other churches, not just in your neighborhood, but across the country. We have a network of churches that can provide each other resources, everything from access to lawyers to being able to move asylum seekers across the country, or even monetary resources. We also have funding at UCC National. We just opened up a new grant at UCC National, in which is a general grant that's eligible for anyone who has a functioning working group to apply for in order to get funding to do advocacy, direct service, accompaniment, refugee resettlement, or be able to get the wheels rolling again post-COVID. So I will also share the link to that new grant that is available from UCC National. And of course, folks like me and Noel and others are there for you. You can join the Sanctuary Movement. You can join the Interfaith Immigration Coalition. These are all folks that can provide resources so that if you do decide to take on any of these tasks, you won't be alone. And then this basically says what I described. We have a number of resources at UCC National that you can reach out with. And whatever you do in immigration ministries, you are not alone. We have resources, both monetary, informational partnerships that we can make sure that you're plugged into so that you have a safety net when you are doing this very important work. So that's all the information I have. I know that, like I said, this session is a pretty heavy one, but just because it's heavy doesn't mean it's not important. It's. I think this is the area in which we need to do the most work within the church, and also given the future of what's about to happen with changes to our asylum system, it's important that we rise up and meet those needs. So I do appreciate you attending, and I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions, either for myself or for Noel. Hi, Anne. I see your question in the chat about bus tickets. Yeah, I'm pretty sure Miles for Migrants does do bus tickets
I
as well.
just looked online and it seemed like it's all air miles unless it's buried pretty far into their website. So
well, like I said, they aren't really advertising the bus tickets because they got overwhelmed. There's more requests for bus tickets than there is funding. But that's the main function of it.
I think most of the border shelters, I mean, depends on their funding, but I know a lot of them help with bus tickets. That's also a problem we've been seeing, is that some shelters are going ahead, and there's these Abbott buses that, the governor is trying to, in Texas, is trying to make a sort of political ploy out of the migrant situation and send them to Washington, D.C. And so when there is an influx in some of the shelters, some of the shelters, but also just the hearsay, it's kind of free ticket. Migrants have actually been getting on those buses if they're going somewhere on the Eastern Seaboard, for example. And so, that's kind of connected to some of these conversations about respite centers, is how do we, instead of this sort of unfaithful program that Abbott's trying to use for his own political points, how do we kind of relieve pressure border and some of these other respite centers? But the transportation is always a big issue, and trying to get people to their destination locations where they have a family member. And it becomes particularly, a lot of the accompaniment, if they have a family member, it's much smoother for congregations to also assist. And there's still a lot of assistance that's needed, but perhaps they'll have some stability with a family member. There is a good percentage of, I don't know, maybe 10% or more, that people that come through that don't have any contacts, any friends or family.
I was just trying to think of something small. We don't have a ton of money, and that seemed like a great thing to try to, get people excited about giving money for something small. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think if something like that, you could connect with the Southwest Conference around, because they have volunteers in the Phoenix Welcome Center, as well as the Tucson Casa Alitas, and then there's a shelter that they are part of that was mentioned in Nogales.
Okay, so just connect with them and see what their needs are. Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, maybe circle back with Irene and I first, and then we can connect you around that.
Yeah, we have a little bit of a connection with Randy Myers, so we could.
Okay,
talk
yeah,
to him,
we know
so.
Randy. Just reach out to him. Any other questions out there?
Okay, well, thank you all for attending this session. I guess we will go ahead and end at 4 since there aren't any questions at this time. But please feel free to email any questions that you may have, or give me or Reverend Anderson a call. We're happy to talk to you more about it. Like I said, of all the types of forced migration, this one is the one that needs the most assistance. And I think that we've covered several ways in which churches can assist in a variety of capacities. Another small way a church could help is to join these respite center networks if you're in one of those major transit cities. But yes, always donating to the border shelters is always a good use of funding, or sending food or other material items. But you have to call first and make sure that you're sending the right ones, because the whole function of this is to make sure that those systems on the border don't get overwhelmed when Title 42 gets overturned. And as always, we do encourage you to use your voice to advocate for these changes to happen, because it's being heard. Okay, thank you so much for participating in this series, and God bless you and your ministry as you move forward. Thank you.